It is too much like the conceit of those dramatic poets, who used to conclude each act with a rhyme, and the expression in the first line of his couplet, celestial powers, though proper in pagan poetry, is ill suited to Christianity, with a conformity to which he consoles himself. How much better would it have been to have ended with the prose sentence, I shall never envy the honours which wit and learning obtain in any other cause, if I can be numbered among the writers who have given ardour to virtue and confidence to truth. His friend, Dr. Birch, being now engaged in preparing an edition of Raleigh's smaller pieces, Dr. Johnson wrote the following letter to that gentleman. To Dr. Birch, Gow Square, May 12, 1750. Sir, knowing that you are now preparing to favour the public with a new edition of Raleigh's miscellaneous pieces, I have taken the liberty to send you a manuscript, which fell by chance within my notice. I perceive no proofs of forgery in my examination of it, and the owner tells me that, as he has heard, the handwriting is Sir Walter's. If you should find reason to conclude it genuine, it will be a kindness to the owner, a blind person, to recommend it to the booksellers. I am, Sir, your most humble servant, Sam Johnson. His just abhorrence of Milton's political notions was ever strong, but this did not prevent his warm admiration of Milton's great poetical merit, to which he has done illustrious justice, beyond all who have written upon the subject. And this year he not only wrote a prologue, which was spoken by Mr. Garrick before the acting of Comus at Drury Lane Theatre, for the benefit of Milton's granddaughter, but took a very zealous interest in the success of the charity. On the day preceding the performance, he published the following paper in the General Advertiser, addressed to the printer of that paper. Sir, that a certain degree of reputation is acquired merely by approving the works of genius, and testifying a regard to the memory of authors, is a truth too evident to be denied, and therefore to ensure a participation of fame with a celebrated poet, many who would, perhaps, have contributed to starve him when alive, have heaped expensive pageants upon his grave. It must indeed be confessed that this method of becoming known to posterity with honour is peculiar to the great, or at least to the wealthy, but an opportunity now offers for almost every individual to secure the praise of paying a just regard to the illustrious dead, united with the pleasure of doing good to the living. To assist industrious indigents, struggling with distress and debilitated by age, is a display of virtue, and an acquisition of happiness and honour. Whoever, then, would be thought capable of pleasure in reading the works of our incomparable Milton, and not so destitute of gratitude as to refuse to lay out a trifle in rational and elegant entertainment for the benefit of his living remains, for the exercise of their own virtue, the increase of their reputation, and the pleasing consciousness of doing good, should appear at Drury Lane Theatre tomorrow, April 5, when Comus will be performed for the benefit of Mrs. Elizabeth Foster, the granddaughter to the author, and the only surviving branch of his family. N.B. There will be a new prologue on the occasion, written by the author of Irene, and spoken by Mr. Garrick, and, by particular desire, there will be added to the masque a dramatic satire, called Lethe, in which Mr. Garrick will perform. 1751. Etat 42. In 1751 we are to consider him as carrying on both his Dictionary and Rambler. But he also wrote the Life of Chanel, in the miscellany called The Student, and the Reverend Dr. Douglas having, with uncommon acuteness, clearly detected a gross forgery and imposition upon the public by William Lauder, a Scotch schoolmaster, who had, with equal impudence and ingenuity, represented Milton as a plagiary from certain modern Latin poets, Johnson, who had been so far imposed upon as to furnish a preface and postscript to his work, now dictated a letter for Lauder, addressed to Dr. Douglas, acknowledging his fraud in terms of suitable contrition. This extraordinary attempt of Lauder was no sudden effort. He had brooded over it for many years, and to this hour it is uncertain what his principal motive was, unless it were a vain notion of his superiority, in being able, by whatever means, to deceive mankind. To effect this, he produced certain passages from Grotius, Messenius, and others, which had a faint resemblance to some parts of the Paradise Lost. In these he interpolated some fragments of Hogg's Latin translation of that poem, alleging that mass thus fabricated was the archetype from which Milton copied. These fabrications he published from time to time in the Gentleman's Magazine, and exulting in his fancied success, he in 1750 ventured to collect them into a pamphlet, entitled An Essay on Milton's Use and Imitation of the Moderns in his Paradise Lost. To this pamphlet Johnson wrote a preface, in full persuasion of Lauder's honesty, and a postscript recommending, in the most persuasive terms, a subscription for the relief of a granddaughter of Milton, of whom he thus speaks: "It is yet in the power of a great people to reward the poet whose name they boast, and from their alliance to whose genius they claim some kind of superiority to every other nation of the earth; that poet, whose works may possibly be read when every other monument of British greatness shall be obliterated, to reward him, not with pictures or with medals, which if he sees with contempt, but with tokens of gratitude, which he perhaps may even now consider as not unworthy the regard of an immortal spirit." Surely this is inconsistent with enmity towards Milton, which Sir John Hawkins imputes to Johnson upon this occasion, adding, "I could all along observe that Johnson seemed to approve not only of the design but of the argument, and seemed to exult in a persuasion that the reputation of Milton was likely to suffer by this discovery. That he was not privy to the imposture, I am well persuaded, but that he wished well to the argument may be inferred from the preface, which indubitably was written by Johnson." Is it possible for any man of clear judgment to suppose that Johnson, who so nobly praised the poetical excellence of Milton in a postscript to this very discovery, as he then supposed it, could at the same time exult in a persuasion that the great poet's reputation was likely to suffer by it? This is an inconsistency of which Johnson was incapable, nor can anything be more fairly inferred from the preface than that Johnson, who was alike distinguished for ardent curiosity and love of truth, was pleased with an investigation by which both were gratified. That he was actuated by these motives, and certainly by no unworthy desire to deprecate our great epic poet, is evident from his own words; for, after mentioning the general zeal of men of genius and literature to advance the honour and distinguish the beauties of Paradise Lost, he says, "Among the inquiries to which this ardour of criticism has naturally given occasion, none is more obscure in itself, or more worthy of rational curiosity, than a retrospect of the progress of this mighty genius in the construction of his work, a view of the fabric gradually rising, perhaps, from small beginnings, till its foundation rests in the centre, and its turrets sparkle in the skies; to trace back the structure through all its varieties, to the simplicity of its first plan; to find what was first projected, whence the scheme was taken, how it was improved, by what assistance it was executed, and from what stores the materials were collected; whether its founder dug them from the quarries of nature, or demolished other buildings to embellish his own." Is this the language of one who wished to blast the laurels of Milton? Though Johnson's circumstances were at this time far from being easy, his humane and charitable disposition was constantly exerting itself. Mrs. Anna Williams, daughter of a very ingenious Welsh physician, and a woman of more than ordinary talents and literature, having come to London in hopes of being cured of a cataract in both her eyes, which afterwards ended in total blindness, was kindly received as a constant visitor at his house while Mrs. Johnson lived, and after her death, having come under his roof in order to have an operation upon her eyes performed with more comfort to her than in lodgings, she had an apartment from him during the rest of her life, at all times when he had a house. Section 17.